This is The Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. Today's episode is sponsored by The Reason Speakeasy, a monthly unscripted conversation in New York City with outspoken defenders of free thinking and heterodoxy. Go to reason.com/events for information and tickets to the next one. My guest today is Musa al-Gharbi, a sociologist at Stony Brook University and the author of the new book, We Have Never Been Woke: The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. Al-Gharbi argues that academics, journalists, and other elite professionals that he calls symbolic capitalists are disconnected from the marginalized and disadvantaged communities they claim to champion and represent. We talk about how wokeness has transformed the college experience, why Blacks and Hispanics appear to be embracing Donald Trump in record numbers, and al-Gharbi's own cancellation in 2014 after he criticized U.S. foreign policy. Here is the Reason interview with Musa al-Gharbi. Musa, thanks for coming out.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and great applause.
Yeah. All right. Well, you're really working the crowd already. So let's start with the title of the book. We Have Never Been Woke. What does it mean to be woke? And you write about at least 4 Great Awokenings, and we're in one. So what does it mean to be woke, and what is the awakening that we've been kind of stuck in for the past decade or so?
Sure. So the title is a play on a different book by another sociologist, Bruno Latour. So he wrote a book called We Have Never Been Modern. And in that book, his basic argument is that the story that we moderns tell ourselves about what sets us apart from other people, these stories actually obscure the nature of the modern world and make it difficult for us to understand the problems of modernity. And so in a similar way, I argue that the stories that a lot of knowledge economy professionals tell ourselves about how we're champions for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, about how we're on the right side of history and so on, these stories prevent us from understanding how a lot of social problems come about and persist, who benefits from them and how, and therefore interfere with our ability to actually make progress on a lot of these things that we say we want.
But it is very flattering to, if you are part of what you call symbolic capitalists, and we'll get into that in a second, but to be like, no, I'm super woke. And in fact, if it wasn't for me, the world would be a horrible place.
Yeah, so we have these, one of the things that's really interesting about people who work in the symbolic professions, so consulting, law, finance, journalism, education, science, technology, chances are if you're in this room, you're the subject of this book.
And by that he means you are not just part of the problem, you're almost the whole problem.
So one of the things that's interesting about a lot of the symbolic professions is that from the beginning of a lot of these fields, from the time that they were organized in their recognizably modern form, they were rooted in altruism and serving the common good. So for instance, journalists are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to speak truth to power and be a voice for the voiceless. And academics are supposed to kind of research the truth and speak the truth without regards to political or economic interests. And
we should throw in stand-up comedians as well, right? That they're the ultimate truth tellers. But
even people like it's truth tellers, and then even people like artists and stuff are supposed to not be concerned about things like status and money. It's kind of considered pathetic if you're kind of doing art for these kinds of purposes rather than trying to express these higher truths.
What goes into wokeness? And when we talk a lot about wokeness. What is wokeness? The way that you describe it in the book.
Yeah. So what I do in the book, what I don't do in the book, is provide some kind of crisp analytic definition. And there's a few reasons why I don't do this. One of them is that I think it's there's this kind of game we play in the discourse that I hate, which is like, define something. If you can't define this thing in a 2-sentence unobjectionable way, then you don't even know what you're talking about. And that's silly. So as Wittgenstein argued, and as someone who studies language and communication and stuff, as Wittgenstein argued, that's just not the way language works. So in my interpersonal communications classes, I tell my students, okay, define for me apple. Give me necessary and sufficient conditions for apple that includes 100% of apples and excludes all other objects in the world. And the students, it turns out, that's very hard. But that doesn't mean we don't know what apples are. If I tell the students, go get me an apple, they're not going to bring me a computer. Well, they might bring me an Apple computer, but if I'm not, depending on the language. But they're not going to bring me a chair or right. a roast beef. They're gonna right. And so the idea that we need these kind of crisp analytic definitions in order to understand and talk about these
what is a vague and unsatisfying definition?
Yeah, so in lieu of a definition, what I do is I try to provide a thick description. So there are these things, there are a whole bunch of modes of talking and thinking about the world that people across the spectrum tend to associate with wokeness and that are not super controversial. So for instance, take the idea of trans-inclusive feminism. So someone who is not a feminist would not be considered woke. And that's true on the left, that's true on the right, that's true anywhere in between. If you're like, feminism sucks, no one goes, oh, well, you're woke. And then similarly, even if you're a feminist, but you're a trans-exclusionary feminist.
Right, or a TERF.
Yeah, then you're not considered woke. So like J.K. Rowling, no one goes, oh, wow, look how woke J.K. Rowling is, right? Even though she self-identifies as a feminist, right? And so there are a whole bunch of things like this where you can so in the book, I kind of walk through a bunch of these kinds of beliefs and dispositions to kind of give a texture to what people seem to be talking about. They don't cohere into a definition in that way.
But it is you use the terms thick kind of description, and we kind of know it when we see it. It's a gummy ball of wax, and stuff kind of clings to it.
And what's interesting is the same constellation of kind of modes of political engagement and thought. It's gone by other names in the past. So before, it was in the late 80s, early 90s, the same collection of things was called political correctness. And you saw a similar kind of dynamic play out with the term political correctness that you see with woke today. So people used to use the term political correctness unironically. Like they would say, I'm PC, and they would be proud of it. But then there was this dispute within the left where one faction of the left used politically correct to mean my moral and political views are correct.
Right.
And another faction of the left started associating PC culture with like this kind of sanctimonious, purely symbolic kind of politics. And then eventually this dispute within the left got picked up by the right, and they started hammering everything that they dislike as politically correct. And then eventually it became kind of being politically incorrect, took on a popular valence. So you had people like Bill Maher, who has
makes a career out of it, right? And the same thing with wokeness.
With wokeness, you're seeing it today.
Now people are woke scolds, and it becomes weaponized from without the movement that generated it.
Yeah, absolutely. So no one would self-identify as woke today. And in fact, real quick, there's this great survey that came out that asked Americans, how do you feel about woke, the term woke? And most Americans felt pretty positive about it, actually, on balance. But then they were like, if someone called you woke, would you understand that to be an insult or a compliment? And Americans overwhelmingly were like, it'd be an insult, of course, because that's the only way it's used today, right? And so a lot of times when I use the word woke in the book, I actually put it in quotes just to signal that it is this kind of highly contentious term.
What, I guess it was Matt Iglesias who popularized the term the Great Awokening, which is a play on the Great Awakening, or a series of religious revivals in American history. You talk about previous Great Awokenings, such as the late 80s, early 90s with PC, but this one you pegged to starting in the very early teens, like around 2011. What was what were the series of events or moments that kind of created the world that we're talking about?
Yeah, so in the book, I argue that there are these three previous periods of awakening, and they actually correspond. We have this kind of fun colloquial way of talking about them, actually. So we talk about, for instance, feminism happening in waves. You have the first wave of feminism, the second, we're in the fourth now. Those waves of feminism actually correspond kind of cleanly with these moments of awakening, looking at a bunch of empirical measures. So there's this kind of nerdy way you can look at these things with a bunch of statistics,
right?
But it actually correlates nicely with this other colloquial language we've already developed to talk about these shifts. Okay, so the latest awakening, started, I argue, around 2010. And it started with the Occupy Wall Street movement. That's actually where I start this awakening in the book. And that's an unusual argument in a way, because in a lot of the popular, so you have people like Vivek Ramaswamy, for instance, who argued that the Great Awokening was cooked up by corporate elites to kind of distract from the class-based, broad-based class movement that was Occupy Wall Street or something like this. But as I show in the book, it's just not true that Occupy Wall Street was a broad-based movement. It was actually consolidated primarily in knowledge economy hubs. The people who were taking part in it were overwhelmingly people from relatively affluent, highly educated backgrounds who were oriented towards the symbolic professions. And even the way the movement was carried out, to call it class-based is a little strange, because like as Richard Reeves argued, these narratives of like, we are the 99%, that's not really a class-based, like that's not really a rich class-based analysis. It allows people to have these like robust six-figure incomes to go, oh, I'm just an ordinary Joe. Right. Me and the janitor, we're in the same boat. Yeah. Like, right? That's not a robust, that's not a...
That's a big part of the book, right? Which is that symbolic capitalists are kind of arbitraging actual the experience of actually disadvantaged people to be like, well, because I'm not Peter Thiel or Elon Musk, I'm part of the same 99% as somebody or delivering food on Uber Eats.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the problems, one of the big problems, our mental blocks for understanding, is because we often define ourselves in juxtaposition to elites. We think of ourselves as the people who hold elites to account, and we kind of convey the things from the people up to elites and just take things from the elites and give it down to the people. But this problem is that this mentality, this narrative we tell ourselves has never been true. So I'll give a quick example. At the beginning of the symbolic professions, so in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, there were two big things that happened. There was the income tax got authorized and defended in the Supreme Court. And you saw the beginning of big philanthropy organizations as we understand them today. And as a result of these two developments, there was this massive transfer of wealth downwards, from the Gilded Age elites downwards. Okay, but where did the money go? As Randall Collins shows in his book, The Credential Society, the primary transfer of wealth that actually happened in this period was from the rich to the upper middle class. Symbolic capitalists took from the rich and we gave to ourselves. And there was a little bit that went, it's not like nothing went down below us. There were programs that were created, ordinary people did benefit a little bit, but the people who benefited the most was us, symbolic capitalists, the upper middle class.
Talk a little bit about symbolic capitalists. What do you mean by that? And define this with a little bit more clarity than woke, but give us the capsule summary of what makes somebody a symbolic capitalist.
Yeah, so the term is, I borrow it from Bourdieu. He had this notion of Pierre Bourdieu was a sociologist, a French sociologist who studied inequality and a lot of other things, and he had this notion of symbolic capital as the ways that different elite factions justified inequalities in status, inequalities in wealth. Symbolic capital is the resources that elites draw upon to make the social relations, unequal social relations seem normal, inevitable, just, reasonable, and so on. And he came up with a few different types of symbolic capital. Should I walk through them? Okay. So he came up with like 3 different forms of symbolic capital that he focused on in his book Distinction, where he kind of coined this term. So there's academic capital, which is when folks go, you should defer to me, you should listen to me, you should do what I want you to do, because like I'm a Columbia, I'm an Ivy League graduate, or because I have a PhD in blah, or I'm an expert in duh, or I write for the New York Times. So academic capital is when you use associations or associations with knowledge economy institutions or credentials, things like this, to get other people to do what you want, to defer to you, and so on. And then there is political capital, which is when you get other people to defer to what you want because they perceive it to be either an obligation on their part or they are convinced that it's in their best interest to do what you want them to do. So an example, if you're a manager in an organization and you say, do this, and the reason why you have to do this is because I'm the manager. Sweep the floor. I'm the manager. I told you to sweep the floor. Or because you have some kind of reputation of having of being like highly competent or highly effective or whatever, so people just do what you tell them to do because they think it'll work out well for them. Okay, so that's political capital. And then finally, there's cultural capital, which is when people do what you want because they think you're cool or interesting or sophisticated, and they want to ingratiate themselves with you. They want to be like you. They want you to like them, and so on. So cultural capital is when you have other people defer to you and listen to you on the basis of these kinds of things. And so collectively, these different forms of symbolic capital mark people as like insiders or outsiders or geniuses or hacks or people with authority or people that you don't have to listen to, and so on and so forth. And it's how inequalities seem natural. Okay, so I call the knowledge economy professionals, I call them symbolic capitalists, because the main way that we kind of make a living is based on what we know, who we know, and how we're known. So basically by producing and leveraging symbolic capital on behalf of ourselves and other people, like especially kind of rich people and so on. And so people who are symbolic capitalists, again, are people who work in jobs where they're not providing physical goods and services to people, where they're trafficking in things like data and ideas.
So, I mean, it's broadly, it's people in the knowledge economy generally. Does it include, people like engineers and doctors, or is it more geared towards people like academic, media people, business people?
It includes engineers, although there's kind of interesting political differences in the symbolic professions, where the closer you get to doing physical goods and things, kind of the more you're likely to lean Republican. And actually, there's this kind of fun split in the medical profession between physicians and surgeons. So physicians are basically symbolic capitalists. Like, what does a physician do? They diagnose and they prescribe. They don't do physical interventions on people. They have people for that. They have nurses. They have, right? But surgeons are defined by doing these physical things on, like, cut you open and so on. And so what's interesting is when you look at the political affiliations of doctors versus surgeons, physicians versus surgeons, physicians politically are just like other symbolic capitalists. They're almost exclusively, like, they're overwhelmingly Democrat. Surgeons lean hard right, similar to people who do other physical things. And it turns out this divide between physicians and surgeons, between people who actually do things to bodies and people who diagnose and prescribe, this tension between them actually goes back like centuries. Physicians have long looked down on surgeons and dentists and other people who do physical...
Because they're doing practical work.
Yeah.
It's not mind work.
Exactly. And then the people who do practical work have long resented the physicians because they sit there judging them and not actually doing things to people.
So, I mean, the subtitle of the book is The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. And one of the things that you talk about, or you come back to at several points, is that what is one of the things that's striking about our elites now, our symbolic capitalists, is that they so identify with the disadvantaged and the outsiders. Why are they doing that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes in part because the foundation, the professions themselves are often defined in terms of altruism and the common good. Like from the beginning, the reason why we enjoy the status that we enjoy, the wealth that we enjoy, the autonomy that we have, the extraordinary freedom we often have in our jobs compared to all other workers. We have from the beginning justified these things by saying, you should give us these things because if you do, it will be good for everyone in society, especially the marginalized and the disadvantaged. So if you look at the AAUP's statements on academic freedom,
so
for instance,
the American Association of University Professors.
Yeah. If you look at their foundational documents justifying academic freedom, that's literally what they do. They say, you should give us this autonomy and stuff because we serve this big public good and everyone will be better off, especially the most. Like, they literally make that case exactly like that. And they're not unique in this way. Journalists and so on and so forth, down to symbolic professions. And so the fact that our autonomy, our pay, our prestige has been justified by this appeals to serving the common good created this unique form of status competition in these professions where the people who are especially effective at painting themselves as sharing the right values or being especially effective at promoting the right goals are seen as being especially worthy of power and prestige and wealth. And the people who are successfully painted as not doing that, as holding the wrong beliefs or engaging in actions that are pernicious. If you're successfully painted that way, you'll often find your position and your prestige and your social standing threatened. And in fact, you could very well lose your job or find yourself a pariah.
What is the cultural contradiction, though, between saying, you are a graduate of Columbia's PhD program in sociology? We should probably give them a round of applause for that because we're not worthy. And you're a tenure track professor at a major research university. What is contradictory about you helping to clarify why we should be doing more for disadvantaged people?
I mean, yeah. So let's just stick with the Columbia example. So Columbia University. I should just say, I'm really grateful for my time at Columbia University. Being at Columbia University, it changed my life. It changed my life to a degree that's hard. I was selling shoes before I went to Columbia University. That's what I was doing. And I would pitch things to the New York Times, and the New York Times wouldn't even give me a no. I was beneath rejection. And
as a shoe salesman, you don't rate, right? But as a grad student at Columbia,
the editors at the New York Times and other places reached out to me. Hey, would you like to write something about blah? And it wasn't because I became a much better writer in the time it took to move from Sierra Vista to it's purely institutional effects, network effects. So being associated with Columbia University changed my life. I should just say that off the get-go. But the main purpose, so Columbia does a lot of things. They have fancy nerds who do cool research, and so on. But the main thing that Columbia does, probably its biggest social purpose, is to mark people as being worthy of elites, worthy of being elites, to mark people as elites, as people worth listening to and deferring to. So in virtue of being at Columbia, all of a sudden, I became someone worth listening to before I was not even someone worth considering. I wasn't even worth a no. All of a sudden at Columbia, I'm someone worth listening to, right? And so this is actually the main function that institutions like Columbia serve, is identifying people as elites, marking them as people to be worth listening to, and making people who are elites feel like they deserve it, like they earn it, like they're worthy of their elite status. And so people like me, for instance, at Columbia, shoe salesman guy, now I'm at Columbia, the kind of bootstrappy story of blah, blah, blah. Having people like me at an institution like Columbia serves a lot of purposes for that legitimation scheme, right? So if you're the son of a rich person who kind of coasted, who went to elite school your whole life and you were really well supported and blah, 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 and you find yourself in Columbia and you also have people like me in Columbia, then everyone just feels like they're kind of bootstrappy people who deserve what they have because of their merit and so on and so forth. So even having people like me helps, with this mystification scheme of, and so there's this kind of striking thing where if you're at Columbia, almost everyone there thinks of themselves as kind of advocates and allies for the marginalized and the disadvantaged. But the whole reason why you go to a school like Columbia is to become an elite. That's the main reason you go to a university at all. That's one of, but especially a school like Columbia, and the reason you go to Columbia instead of your land-grant university is because you want to be even more elite than other college graduates. And so this is a school that's designed to produce elites and to make elites feel like they deserve what they have. But everyone in there feels like they're egalitarians who are really deeply committed to helping the marginalized and the disadvantaged and so on. And so that's an example of a cultural contradiction. And
if I may, then you also hammer home the idea that people in that elite class depend. They say I am there. Everybody's like Tom Joad. I'm there. When the striker is being beaten up by the cop and everything. But in fact, what you're saying is their entire existence depends upon the exploited labor of the lower classes that they claim to be part of and to represent.
In order to live the lifestyles that a lot of us aspire to and take for granted, this is one of the core tensions of the symbolic professions I argue in the book. One of the core cultural contradictions is that we have these two drives that are both sincere. I think it's not the case that we're cynical or insincere when we say we want the poor to be lifted up. We want the people who are marginalized and disadvantaged in society to live lives of dignity and things like that. I don't think people are being cynical or insincere about that. But that's not our only sincere commitment. We also really want to be elites, which is to say, we think that our opinions and our views and our wishes should carry more weight than the person checking us out at the grocery store. We think we should have a higher standard of living than the person who's selling us clothes, selling us shoes at Dillard's. We think, and we want our children to reproduce or have an even higher social position than us. And these tensions these drives are in fundamental tension, right? You can't be an egalitarian social climber. It's a contradiction in terms, right?
And then adding to that is the fact, a part of your argument is that we've been overproducing elites so that they are going through, it's an anxious group because there really aren't, there's only so many elite slots out there. And suddenly you're competing with everybody. They're even competing with you, right? And so that creates a lot of anxiety, and that has the effect of making people more extreme versions of what they would be.
Yeah, I mean, and so the symbolic capitalists are anxious in a few ways. I mean, one way is that for a lot of us, what we trade heavily on is things like status. And status is something that you can't really ever own. It's something that's given you to other people and that can be taken away by other people in a second. And a lot of people who are canceled discover just how fast it can disappear, right? And so the fact that we can never really own status, but we trade on status, that is a source of anxiety. This sense that this question that we have about whether we actually deserve the things is a source of anxiety. Mm-hmm. But then there's this precarity. There's this precarity yeah. And so elite overproduction is a concept coined by sociologist Jack Goldsmith and historian Peter Turchin. And it refers to a situation where society is producing a lot more people who have a reasonable expectation to be an elite, but we don't have the ability to give them the elite life they're looking for. So you did everything right. You went to school. You graduated from college. You got good grades. You even went to the right college. But instead of getting a six-figure income, you're finding that you're having unsteady work. You can't really get married. You can't really buy a house like your parents. You can't live the kind of life that you expected. When you have that kind of a thing happening, when you're producing more and more of these disgruntled erstwhile elites, what they tend to do is start indicting the order that they think failed them, and try to kind of tear down the people who are succeeding in order to make room for people like themselves. And I argue that's fundamentally what these periods of Great Awakening are at their core. But elite overproduction, I argue, isn't the only condition that's necessary for an awakening, because the problem is, as my advisor Seamus Khan argued, so I footnote my conversations, I apologize. But as my advisor Seamus Khan argued,
I thought you were just name dropping.
The fortunes of elites and non-elites tend to operate countercyclically. So times that are really good for elites tend to be kind of tough times for other workers, because elites have more power to dictate things like your pay and your labor conditions and stuff, right? And then on the flip side, times that are kind of lean for elites tend to be pretty good times for other workers. They have a lot more bargaining power to push back against and so on. And so oftentimes when elites are going through a tough time, it's hard to get anyone to care. No one's pulling out their tiny violin and going, for the, poor elite, you have to get a normal job like everyone else and live a normal life like everyone else. Ooh, right? But there are these times... But there are these times when these trajectories collapse, when things have been kind of bad and growing worse for ordinary people for a while, and all of a sudden they're bad for a lot of elites too. Those are moments when awakenings tend to happen.
So, and this brings us back to Occupy, which comes out of the financial crisis.
Absolutely, yeah. And so in these moments when the trajectories get collapsed, you have the elites have a motive. A motive to engage in this kind of power struggle, but they also have a means, because there's a whole bunch of other people around them who are also pissed off about the way things are going, who also have a beef with the people who are running the show. And so they have a lot more leverage over institutions than they normally would. I argue like these are the two big factors to predict a Great Awakening: elite overproduction plus popular immiseration. The first two awakenings were a little different. I'll just add real quick. One thing that was a little different about the first two was that there was a third condition or a third factor that was really relevant, and that was war. Because there was kind of forced conscription after World War I. The draft was passed and successfully defended in the Supreme Court. And so at the time that the first awakening happened, a lot of elite aspirants were worried about getting drafted into war. It seemed like another war was brewing, and ultimately it was, of course. And then same thing in the 1960s awakening, the Second Great Awokening. The Vietnam War and anti-war protests were a big part of that. And in fact, the awakening actually kicked off as a result of changes to the draft, which made it so that relatively affluent people who had been sitting in universities trying to ride out the war and let poor people and minorities die, all of a sudden were like, oh crap, I have to fight too. And that was actually when the awakening kicked off. But then, and this is a kind of crisis, this is a crisis for elites that's just as big as the financial situation, right? Like much more severe than worrying about if you have a good job is worrying if you're gonna die or be maimed or something like that. But then after Nixon ended the draft, after the Second Great Awakening, this factor became less salient going forward. So in all four cases, you have elite overproduction plus popular immiseration. But one thing that was an accelerant in the first two cases was the fact that elites were also having skin in the game about being deployed to war, no longer relevant.
What happens, in the Occupy movement? How does it go from being, one about economics, really? It did, and it's true. If you're going to say this is a class-based analysis and there's the 1% and the rest of us, that's terrible Marxism, right? It's terrible class analysis. But how did it go from that to being fundamentally about identity politics? Because by, the early teens and as the economy started to recover, we seem to be talking less about class and more about race and ethnicity and sexual orientation or expression.
Well, so one of the things that's interesting about Occupy is that even during Occupy, there was these kind of weird kind of identitarian bureaucratic norms about who could talk when. There was this kind of progressive stack procedure.
Yeah, could you explain what the progressive stack is? Because that's a concept that is really important, but I think we've kind of forgotten about it.
Yeah, well, it was just this kind of procedure for who gets to have a voice and what sequence people have a voice, and if you spoke out of turn, you would be, get criticized. And again, like one of the things that's interesting is that for all of the awakenings, actually, you see this. For most of the awakenings, you actually see this combination of kind of class-based and identity-based stuff. So in the first Great Awakening, for instance. You had students saying things like, educated for jobs that haven't materialized, will take the education that we learned and use it to tear down the system. So they just basically state the elite overproduction thesis quite explicitly in newspapers and stuff. And but then you also, in the first Great Awakening in the 1920s, you have the first wave of feminism, you have the first gay rights organizations, you have the New Negro movement, you even have this kind of intersectional approach to social justice. So George Orwell, writing at the tail end of the first Great Awakening, so in the 1930s, in The Road to Wigan Pier, he says, sometimes it seems like the very words communism and socialism, as if with magnetic force, draw to them every nature cure quack and vegetarian and sex deviant, and all of these people in England just get sucked in as if with magnetic force to the words communism and social. So even all of these other forms of kind of social deviance and activism being kind of bound up with these class movements, this is just something that's a recurrent thing. But yeah, so basically, it seems like what happens is Occupy fails. It fails for a few reasons. One, because the people who are taking part in it just refuse to, for instance, put forward demands or a political platform or anything like that, which not a great way to make any change happen. Two, they just failed to form cross-analysis with, like, it was just symbolic capitalists in these hubs. And then three, they were eventually just pushed out of the parks they were occupying. But there was still this anger and this frustration and stuff, so it just went to other, as Occupy fizzled out and was kind of tapered, then But there was a whole bunch of other things. So there were so many. So the same people that were taking part in Occupy were also the people saying Black Lives Matter and Me Too and engaging in the March for Science and all the other resistance protests against Trump. It's just been this kind of decade of activism among symbolic capitalists concentrated in our institutions and our communities and so on.
Does it, one of the things that you argue in the book is that the people who are claiming to represent, the fellaheen or the downtrodden are not doing a very good job because they don't actually have any real connection to them. And the underclass is, they're like not going along with this. How do you chart that? And how do you map that?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I show in the book is that, at length in a few of the chapters, is that people who often claim to be representatives or advocates for various groups, they're just demonstrably not representative of those groups in terms of their political views, in terms of their, so for instance,
and in terms of their identity. The ridiculous case is somebody like Rachel Dolezal, who pretended to be black, and obviously was not born black.
Yeah, but there's kind of milder cases of that that happen all the time. So, for instance, I was at an event once on political polarization. There were 4 Black people who were taking part in this conversation. There was me, half white. There were 2 people who were Jamaican, and there was someone who was Kenyan and Nigerian. So not one single person who's a monoracial, non-immigrant Black person, but they represent the vast majority of Black people in America, right? And this matters because people who are mixed race or people who are of immigrant background, they actually have very different life experiences. They have very different risk exposures, very different lifestyle paths, very different sets of resources to draw on. They're treated importantly differently by other people, and so you have the 4 of us representing the Black perspective, not one of us really being in any way particularly representative of the modal experience of Black people in America. But that's not unusual, right? That's actually not unusual in spaces like that. If you look at the people who write for the New York Times, or the people who write for The Atlantic, or who's in higher ed, or so on, almost all of these symbolic capitalist spaces, the panel that we had, that's the panel of Black people. Bertrand Cooper had this great essay called Who Gets to Create Black Culture? And he stressed that, if George Floyd were alive, if he hadn't been killed, and after he was killed, there were all these programs on HBO about him, and NPR and the New York Times and all of that. But if George Floyd, when he was alive, if he wanted to write for the New York Times or do a documentary for HBO, he would have never been able to. He didn't have a degree. He didn't have a degree from the right places. We don't give a shit. We don't give. This
is a libertarian show. You really should be cursing more. But,
in general, places like NPR and HBO and whatever, they don't care one whit what people like George Floyd think about anything. Their perspectives are not included in our institutions. And perversely, it was only when George Floyd was killed, when he became a victim of state violence, and we could use his death in our power struggles, that all of a sudden that we cared about him and his life mattered. And that's sick. And in fact, not only do we not really include a lot of voices of kind of normie Black people in these discussions, but even when people try to, those perspectives are often unwelcome. So Lee Fang got fired from The Intercept for going out on the street and talking to Black people about Black Lives Matter, and some of the people he interviewed was like, Black Lives Matter sucks, it's garbage. And for airing that perspective, he got fired from The Intercept, right? So when we're confronted with the perspectives of normie Black people, and we don't like those perspectives, we often find ways to write off those perspectives or censor or punish the people who presented us with those offensive perspectives.
And again, that's being done in the name of speaking for Black people.
In the name of social justice, firing Lee Fang for letting normie Black people talk to us was a was a thing that was done in the name of social justice, which is wild.
We're going to come back and talk about the election, because this dynamic plays out in interesting ways in your work, in the book, and in America. But before we do that, let's take a brief detour to talk about your biography. You mentioned that you are half white and half black.
But full awesome. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, they'll be the judge of that. You grew up in Arizona. You were raised Catholic, and you were going to be a Catholic priest. Then you became an atheist, and then you became a Muslim. Talk a little bit about how where you're from informs who you are as a sociologist.
Yeah, so it's been a weird journey.
And it's barely getting started. Right?
My initial plan in life was to be a priest. But then I had this crisis of faith.
Which was that from your reading as you were studying to be a priest, you came to believe that Jesus was not the Son of God.
That he didn't understand himself to be
didn't see himself
divine.
To be.
Yeah.
So that means, Christianity, that's a big problem.
It's a big problem, for Catholics, especially. Like in the early church, there was a lot of dispute about the nature of Jesus, but that was settled in Catholicism. And so, if you reject the divinity of Christ, it completely changes the meaning of sacraments like communion and things like that. There was no way to do that. And so for a while, I kind of overcorrected. I was like, if I'm not going to be a Catholic, or if I reject this fundamental tenet of Catholicism or contemporary Christianity, then just maybe all religion is, nonsense and whatever. And so I tried to be, I had kind of rationally convinced myself that religion was garbage and there was no God. And I tried to really live that lifestyle, sex, drugs, rock and roll kind of lifestyle. Quite successfully, but it actually didn't really bring me fulfillment. It just really made me feel empty and hollow, actually. And but more than that, I had kind of rationally convinced myself that there was no God and stuff, but I couldn't make myself feel it, and that left me with a dilemma. Right? It's like I could just try to ignore or deny that feeling that God exists, but then that would make me kind of a bad faith atheist, which is like sad.
That is the bottom of the barrel. Yeah. So how did you come to Islam?
So eventually, as I tried to reckon with this kind of sense that there was probably a God or divine or something like this, I was trying to kind of work through that feeling. I started reading other religious texts from, just texts from other religious traditions. And as part of that journey, I started reading the Quran. And I became convinced that it was a prophetic work. And I was like, well, if I think that Muhammad is a prophet and I believe in God, well, that's like the two big things. That's just shahada right there, right? So maybe I'm a Muslim. So I looked into Islam more, and then eventually I took the plunge in 2009, yeah.
2009. You have a twin brother who was killed in Afghanistan. Does that factor into your religious experiences?
It didn't, it was good that I had rediscovered religion at the time my brother died, because, it's tough no matter what, but it would have been real tough in the state that I was in, my brother's death did totally change my work. So before my brother died, I didn't do anything that was like focused on politics. I was a metaphysician. Mm-hmm. I thought politics was people getting distracted by the little things, and I was focused on the important things like the structure and nature of reality. But then kind of working through my brother's death caused me to reevaluate the importance of politics. And so I shifted my focus. I was already in a philosophy program. I had applied to philosophy programs from community college, and instead of going to NYU, where I had initially planned to going, I went to University of Arizona to be close to my family, and I switched my focus to applied social epistemology, which is like, what do we know in virtue of what? And
Arizona is known for this type of philosophy.
Yeah. And so it was a great place to be. But the idea was I was focused on kind of national security, foreign policy questions, with the hope of trying to help other families avoid the kind of thing that the kind of tragedy that my own family
What do you mean by that? By being anti-war or by coming up with better foreign policy, or?
Yeah, kind of both. I mean, not necessarily, like, I wouldn't have necessarily considered myself like a full blast pacifist at that point. But I was definitely concerned that a lot of interventions were both needless and poorly designed and caused great harm.
Counterproductive.
Yeah, and I ran, while I was at University of Arizona, I managed an academic consortium that brought together combat veterans who were now returning to school, along with students from war-affected regions who were at University of Arizona to study Middle East conflict together. And I was teaching, and then later after I got my master's degree, I was teaching political science classes on national security and foreign policy, national security organizations, international organizations, things like that, until I got canceled by Fox News.
Yeah, let's talk about the cancellation. Yeah, don't sweep that under the rug there. In 2014, you got canceled after you drew a bunch of attention from Fox News. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Sure. So what had happened was basically I published this journal. I published this article in a journal, Middle East Policy, about the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria, and it was a big deal. It was the number one cited journal. I was very excited. And anyway,
there you go again with the symbolic capitalism, right?
Exactly.
You're laying a big wad down on the table. Yeah, number one.
So it was very exciting. But at this time in 2014, like ISIS was a big deal, and there was kind of this whole kind of cottage thing where if you wanted to go on right-leaning media and you were someone who was from the Middle East but hated Islam for whatever reason, you could go either because you were a Muslim but you're not anymore, because whatever. You could go on right-leaning media and be like, Muslims are horrible, I would know, kind of thing, right? And so there was this dude who was part of that circuit. Somehow came across my article on Syria, he hated it, and tried to troll me on Twitter about it. And I just destroyed this guy. I don't even engage this way anymore for reasons that will soon be obvious, but I destroyed this guy. I showed that he was completely ignorant about the facts on the ground in Syria. And as he started to lose the empirical argument, he tried to shift about like liberty and justice. And I was like, great, I'm a philosopher. Let's talk about liberty, and just really twisted the knife about this was a vacuous person. But as a result of humiliating him, he had a much bigger platform than me. I was an adjunct instructor and a columnist for Al Jazeera, but he had access to Fox News, which is the number one rated cable news network in the United States. And so on Election Day 2014, if you would have gone to foxnews.com, you would have seen this beautiful face. Radical Muslim professor corrupting the youth. They talked about me on air a couple of times. Basically, they were using me to fill time until the election results came out. So they just kind of casually destroyed my life as filler.
And you ended up losing your contract at Arizona, right?
I ended up losing my contract at Arizona. And then I tried to apply to grad school at University of Arizona, and I got universally rejected from that as well. And then I was working at a shoe store, and there was a management position open, and I applied to the management position. And the district manager, though, wouldn't promote me because he thought I was overqualified and would be unlikely to stay. And so I couldn't even get a job as, managing my store that I was working at. And so, yeah, it was a very bleak period. But the bright side is, because I had, and so, I was basically, my plan at that point was I was just going to join the military and be an officer.
Destroy it from within? Or?
No. It's just because it's, my grandfather fought in World War II, Korea and Vietnam. Both of my parents, my mom and my biological father were both military. My father served in Desert Storm. My stepdad was in the military. A lot of my brothers, cousins, like I was already the weirdo for just not doing that. But I was like, okay, well, I guess I just have to do the family business. That's really all that's going to work for me. But then I had, but two things happened. First, I started, I responded to getting canceled by Fox News by just trying to engage more with the people who canceled me. So I had before not even tried to write anything for right-leaning media outlets. I just assumed as a Black Muslim intellectual who would want to hear what I have to say, the left. But But then I realized as I was kind of sitting there in my dark night of the soul, figuring out kind of how my life got to this point, I realized that at least part of the problem was that people like me, like why they were willing to believe this wild caricature that was spun of me, is that people like me don't really engage with the Fox News audience too much, and when we do, it's in this sneering, condescending, conflictual way or whatever. So I tried to not do that. So I started taking the same essay that I would normally publish in Al Jazeera or Salon or some other left-leaning place. Took the same essay, didn't self-censor at all, didn't say anything I didn't believe, just changed the framing to speak to conservative values and narratives and frames of reference. And they were readily available to me because I grew up in this conservative town, my mom, by the way, is just MAGA. She's like all about it. And so I took these same, it's funny, she still introduces me to people as her liberal son, which is like no one codes me that way.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I took the same essay and just pitched them to, change the framing and the way that I talked about the issues to make them more accessible.
Could you just very briefly explain, like, give an example of that? What's an essay and a right wing or a conservative outlet that accepted it?
Yeah, I mean, one of my first ones, for instance, was an essay in the American Conservative about why there aren't a lot of Black Republicans. Again, at points it makes for bracing reading.
Yeah.
But it wasn't presented in this kind of sneering way or anything like that. And in fact, I talk a lot about actually the proud tradition within the Republican Party from its founding all the way through people like George Romney. Like George Romney was a mensch. Mitt Romney's like Mitt Romney, lost his backbone and then kind of discovered it later, whatever. But his dad was like awesome. Like he was, anyway, so I talk about this proud tradition of advocacy within the Republican Party and how that unfolded, like how that eroded, and how and so on and so forth. So it's bracing reading, but it wasn't sneering or condescending, and in fact, it was talking about how actually there's a lot of opportunity for the for Republicans to pick up Black voters. That turned out to be very prescient.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's an example of an essay where I was kind of engaging on and doing this, engaging with audiences that didn't already agree with me about topics, and thinking about how to talk and present information to audiences that didn't already cause me to both see blind spots in things I was taking for granted, things that I hadn't thought through fully, that if I was just kind of preaching to the choir, I wouldn't have noticed. Right. So it gave me a richer understanding of a lot of things. And then also it caused me to, it was just a lot more rewarding to engage with people who didn't already agree with me. I learned a lot from those kinds of exchanges, much more than preaching to the choir. And it also caused me to reevaluate the value of my earlier work. Like, if I was trying to get people to not bomb Syria, it doesn't do a lot of good to go publish in Al Jazeera, "Don't bomb Syria," where everyone already agrees that bombing Syria is a bad idea, and we all just go, "Yeah, we're so smart." If you want to prevent the bombing of Syria, you should go to the people who do want to bomb Syria and explain to those people in a way that they actually find persuasive why bombing Syria is a bad idea. It's obvious, but no one does it. So I started doing that, and it changed my life. It changed my life both in the sense of enhancing my research interests. Mm-hmm. It's what sensitized me to some of the work that I did with Heterodox Academy, and it also made my work more impactful. So the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, cited one of my novel statistics to explain why a no-fly zone in Syria probably wouldn't work as intended, right? So that's a kind of impact that I never would have had, preaching to the choir.
And you shifted into, you ended up applying to Columbia for grad school after getting blocked out of University of Arizona and switched to sociology.
So they did me a favor, yes. Yeah. So I got life-changing advice from one of my advisors as I was kind of... So I told my advisor, look, I'm going to join the military. That's it. I tried. It's not working out. I'm moving on. And she's told me, okay, if you really feel that way, I can't stop you, but I think you have a lot of potential as a scholar. You should try one more round, but just apply to the elite schools. Because the schools that you think of are as safe schools, they're not safe for you, because you're a weirdo on paper, A lot of the safe schools are looking for someone who fits into a particular box and it plays to the department's strengths and they kind of know where they're going to. Whereas elite schools are a lot more willing to roll the dice. If you could be the next big thing, or you could explode, or just fail, like they're willing to roll. They have these big endowments. They'll roll the dice to try to get the big prize or whatever. And so the next round, I only applied to elite schools, and I got in everywhere. I got into Yale, I got into Columbia, I got into like everywhere I applied to. So it was life-changing advice.
Yeah. Why did you switch to sociology out of political science or philosophy?
So my master's thesis in philosophy was argued that like a lot of the questions that epistemologists want to answer about knowledge and stuff, like we actually can't answer a lot of those questions from the armchair. They turn on empirical matters. And so they need to be epistemologists to make progress on these questions. They need to either be informed by actual empirical research, or we need to do actual empirical research. And then, so when I was applying to PhD programs, I was like, well, hell, if I feel that way, maybe I should actually be a social scientist and not a philosopher. And so that's why I started moving towards social
You mentioned Heterodox Academy briefly. They're a group that's been around now for about 10 or 15 years, something around that. And, their mission is to increase ideological diversity among faculty. You seem tailor-made. I mean, it's like you were grown in a lab for that. But, what kind of work do you do for them? And are you seeing success in terms of, is the professoriate kind of widening a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, so the work that I do for them now, I don't do as much. So I was the communications director for a while, and then I did a lot of research for them and stuff. I was a research fellow. But after the HXA conference, I stepped back to do the book tour stuff. So these days, I go to the Siegel seminars. They have seminars in Manhattan once a week where they bring in cool people to kind of kick ideas. So I go to those. But other than that, I'm not as involved in the day-to-day these days. But in terms of trends, there are some encouraging trends. One thing that happened that's kind of orthogonal to Heterodox Academy, but is just a positive direction, is that by a lot of empirical measures, and for reasons I describe in the book, the Great Awokening that started after 2010 seems to be tapering down. And that has kind of a lot of spillover benefits for higher ed along a lot of dimensions. But then in terms of like the work that HXA does, Heterodox Academy has been founding a lot of chapters on colleges nationwide to kind of move the work that we do away from the 1,000-foot square of us talking and thinking about things to like actually changing programs and policies at discrete universities and kind of we've been seeing a lot of successes with the campus community, things like policies changing at universities, people becoming more receptive to this problem, to the fact that there is actually a problem with the fact that almost all of us are kind of blue line people. In fact, I guess maybe we'll talk about this in a minute, but like the fact that almost all of us are on the blue line really distorts our understanding of like of political phenomena.
And by the blue line, you mean everybody is
Democrats. Democrats are liberals.
Yeah.
It really messes up our ability to understand political trends.
Well, let's shift into that a little bit. And why you just said the Great Awokening, this version of it seems to be tapering off. Why is that? Yeah.
So the in the book, I argue that the Great Awokenings tend to wind down for two reasons. Because again, so the two factors that predict the Great Awokenings are popular immiseration plus elite overproduction. So usually what happens is as the elite overproduction crisis starts to ebb, a lot of people who are these kind of frustrated elites get folded into the system, and then all of a sudden they have a stake actually in the order not burning down, and they start resisting the people that they used to. So
this is the idea that the tenured radicals then become the most conservative people in society.
Yeah, they're not looking to lose the tenure.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, you can see this. Academia is actually wild in this way, right? Where we have this whole, it's a really hierarchical system. It's a really exploitative system. We have all of these disposable scholars, this whole class of people who do a lot of the teaching, but get paid much less than tenure line professors.
Right. Although, as you point out,
precarity.
They get paid more on average than the typical
household.
So
academics shouldn't do poverty LARPing,
Okay,
but I mean, like, relative to tenure line professors, they're exploited. But they're not exploited in the way that like a Walmart worker is exploited. Like, there's no competition. And when they try to do that competition, it's like sad and non-self-aware. But higher ed is this really hierarchical system. They have this really exploitative labor practices with respect to non-tenure line professors. But like everyone there, but academics are very convinced that they're on the side of social justice, right?
So their jobs shouldn't be disappeared.
They don't want their jobs disappeared. And so the first thing that drives the awakening, that leads the awakenings to dissolve, is that the elite overproduction crisis ebbs. And then secondarily, the secondary thing that leads them to wind down is that you have these kind of coalitions that elites try to build with normies who are pissed off about the way things are going. But as things get better for normies, they also disengage. But then the people that remain angry, it's often tough to hold this coalition together, because at the end of the day, what the elites really want is to be elites. They have really weird ways of talking and thinking about politics that turn off the normie people. And so eventually these coalitions just are unstable and they collapse. And
so does that explain, and I mean, this is something you've been talking about for a long time, but does that explain why Black men, African-American men, and Latino men seem to be defecting from the Democratic Party in historic numbers, or at least over the in the post-war era, and moving towards the Republican Party, or specifically to Trump?
I don't know if it's specifically Trump, actually, because the movement, as I showed in some of my other works, actually predated Trump. It started around 2012 for a lot of the votes with the movement with Black and Hispanics, and actually. I think sometimes people overplay the gender thing, the gender aspect, actually. So in 2020, for instance, Trump got a bigger share of the Black vote, the Hispanic vote. But that was true with Black women and Hispanic women, as well as men. And it was also true with white women. Like, the reason Biden was able to win was despite these defections among women across the board. And especially these defections among Blacks and Hispanics across the board, is because he saw significant gains with white men. So, like, and it's
particularly college educated,
but also people who live in suburbs, people who are relatively affluent. Like, this is the block of America that really cares about things like decorum and civility and the president being presidential, and Trump is not those things, right? And even today, so there was this great tweet by the senior political analyst of NBC News. He put up this tweet that was like...
He sounds very impressive. If this was 1970.
So he put up this tweet from a chart that his own team produced that was like, what's behind Trump's gains with Blacks and Hispanics? Shifts among men and young people. But when you look at the chart, his own chart, what you see is that women actually shifted more than men towards the Republican Party. Black women, Hispanic women, they shifted more than Black and Hispanic men towards the Republican Party over the same period. And so I pointed this out, Matt Iglesias pointed it out, and now that tweet is community noted. But all to say, I think people are kind of locked into this gender narrative, and I don't actually know how. I mean, we'll see in the post-election data kind of what it looks. But I think people are actually kind of maybe overplaying the gender narrative, especially as it relates to.
But does it come down to something as easy that elites, and particularly maybe liberal or progressive elites, believe that Blacks and Latinos will follow their lead, that they will read the tea leaves exactly the same way, but those people feel, or those voting groups feel like they are either they're not getting what they need out of the Democratic Party, or things are getting better for them. So why would they, follow blindly what the professoriate says?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two big problems the Democratic Party faces. One is that because symbolic capitalists, these knowledge economy professionals, because we've become like the core constituency of the Democratic Party, and we shifted a lot. The Democratic Party shifted a lot over the same period I show. You can look at the Democratic Party platform; it shifted hard.
Yeah, this is remarkable, and in the show notes and whatnot, we'll have links to this. But I mean, you've consistently shown that the kind of extremeness of American politics over the past decade or 15 years is really because the left has moved far left, not the right.
The Democratic Party has shifted much, much more than the Republican Party, especially on cultural issues. And a lot of the cultural positions that the Democratic Party is taking are actually off-putting to non-white voters. So if you look, for instance, at which sectors of the Democratic coalition are most skeptical of immigration, like open immigration policies, it's African Americans and Hispanics. Which sectors of the Democratic coalition are most skeptical of gender-affirming care for minors and things like that? Well, that would be Black and Hispanic Americans. Which sectors of the Democratic coalition are most supportive of things like the Muslim ban? Well, that would also be Black and Hispanic voters. Like a lot of Black and Hispanic voters are evangelical or other forms of Christian. They view Islam as a false and dangerous religion, and they're perfectly happy to see less Muslims coming into the country. And this kind of a thing is hard for progressives to process because we often think in these intersectional terms. We view all these struggles as interrelated, and we want to liberate everyone together. But that's not how the people that we claim to represent and want to support think about these issues at all. And so the further the Democratic Party has moved on these cultural issues, the more that they've prioritized these cultural issues over bread and butter things that people actually care about, the more that they've alienated the very populations that they want to represent. And so that's been a big, but the reason why Democrats remain competitive despite alienating minority voters is because the GOP is alienating white voters at the same time. So there's this narrative that whites support Trump in this extraordinary way, and that the reason Trump won because of white voters. That was, as I've shown in my research, that was not true in 2016. Actually, white turnout was stagnant, and he got a smaller share of the white vote. He won because of shifts of minorities. But this has persisted all the way. In 2018, Democrats saw gains purely because of shifts in white voters. In 2020, again, Biden won because of shifts among white men. In 2022, when you look at the midterms, and the same is true today in contemporary polling, whites are shifting more towards the Democratic parties, minorities are shifting more towards the Republican parties.
Well, it sounds like a great opportunity for the Libertarian Party. That's what I'm hearing.
There's a lot of disaffected voters out there.
Can I ask, what is the role of increased, kind of living standards? In your book, you recite from time to time, stats about how the typical American worker is doing worse than they were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. I don't actually agree with that. I think when you look at the median income of Black households or the median income of American households, particularly after taxes and transfers, things are phenomenally better than they were 50 years ago. But is that part of what's going on too, as people see material gains? Their political commitments to, pre-existing political commitments kind of loosen up.
Yeah, I mean, I think like especially things like the black-white income gap or the share of people that are incarcerated, things like that. If you look compared to before the 1960s, they're some of those things are better than they were, but still worse than they were.
Well, and clearly the gaps can persist. But if you look at the median Black household I actually looked this up in 1992, had an income of $37,000. In 2023, it was $57,000 in inflation-adjusted terms. So they might not be catching up to whites, but they're doing significantly better.
Well, and the thing, one of the things that's interesting is that they are doing better, but like college-educated folks, I have a bunch of charts. Like when you look at the kind of median income increase for kind of normies versus symbolic capitalists, like the gaps are growing bigger between us and them, right? So they're doing objectively better than they used to,
right?
But then they see the kind of way that we live and the way that they live.
They see a former shoe salesman kicking their ass, and they're like, "What's going on?" Right?
So that's part of it. And then there is some research that by people like Engelhardt and others that suggests that as standards of living improve, politics tends to move into something like he calls it a post-materialist.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, your work in that of like, we're all, I mean, we're all symbolic capitalists in a lot of ways once you reach a certain level of material stuff, right? Where, I mean, it's all about what it means, not whether or not you have enough to eat. So things can open up in weird ways,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That's
Who, and we're going to go to questions in a minute, so if we can bring the microphone up, but who are you going to vote for in the election?
Well, so I was just telling someone during the break, I actually don't vote. This pisses people off when I say it.
Why is it the P.J. O'Rourke logic that it only encourages them?
Well, no, it's because, I vote for ballot initiatives and things like that, but I don't vote for candidates. And the reason I don't do it is because I used to. Like I say in the book, like my first vote was for John Kerry, which is humiliating in retrospect because
I'm embarrassed.
I didn't just vote for him begrudgingly because the alternative was Bush. Like I was a Kerry stan.
Wow.
God help me. But more than that,
If it
more
makes
than
you feel better, my first presidential vote was for Walter Mondale. So.
Yeah, but more than my lingering humiliation, the reason I don't vote is because I found that the act of kind of thinking of in this way of like who I want to win, who I want to lose, taking part in voting and stuff, I think it messed up my work as a social scientist. Like it, especially because I work on these political issues. And so, I don't think that's the way that all social scientists need to go. Weber famously argued that social scientists should try to be neutral, but we're not only social scientists, and we have duties in society, and acting as ourselves as private individuals in society, we should participate fully. So, I don't think everyone needs to stop voting who's a social scientist. It's just for me personally, for the work that I do, I found it to be liberating mentally.
What is your biggest concern about the 2024 election?
I mean, my biggest concern right now is it pertains to the war in Gaza and what's happening in Lebanon. My wife is from southern Lebanon. Her family had to flee to Beirut. They're getting bombed, and now Beirut is getting bombed. My wife's family could die any moment now. My wife's family could die. That's kind of my number one issue right at this moment. But it doesn't really matter the party.
Yeah, does that matter who gets elected president?
No, it doesn't. I mean, Joe Biden has been enabling this every step of the way. Kamala Harris will probably do the same. Almost all of her statements suggest that. Donald Trump will probably do the same. So if you are someone who is voting on this issue, I would just suggest people vote on whatever else is important to them, because I don't think on this particular issue, unfortunately, it matters who wins.
All right, Musa al-Gharbi, thanks for talking to Reason. The book is We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.